"But that's going to be hard for Meg," Mrs. Watson said. "It's going to be hard for her to realize that we are serious."
"What about me?" Calvin asked.
"The life of your father isn't at stake," Mrs. Watson told him.
"Well, what about Charles Wallace, then?"
Mrs. Watson's unoiled door-hinge voice was warm with affection and pride. Charles Wallace knows that it's far more than just the life of his father. Charles Wallace knows what's at stake."
"But remember," Mrs. Who said,
"Io tenavo et teav, Euripides,
nothing is hopeless. We must hope for everything." "Where are we now, and how did we get here?" Calvin asked.
Ural, the third planet on the star Malak, in the spiral nebula Messier 101.
"This I'm supposed to believe?" Calvin asked indignantly.
"As you like,"
Mrs. Witch said coldly. For some reason Meg felt that Mrs. Witch, despite her looks and ephemeral broomstick, was someone in whom one could put complete trust. "It doesn't seem any more peculiar than anything else that's happened." "Well, then someone just tell me how we got here." Calvin's voice was still angry, and his freckles seemed to stand out on his face. "Even traveling at the speed of light, it would take us years and years to get here."
"Oh, we don't travel at the speed of anything," Mrs. Watson explained earnestly. "We tesser, or you might say we wrinkle."
"Clear as mud," Calvin said. Tesser, Meg thought. Could that have anything to do with Mother's tesseract? She was about to ask when Mrs. Witch started to speak, and one did not interrupt when Mrs. Witch was speaking.
"Mrs. Watson is young and naive."
"She keeps thinking she can explain things in words," Mrs. Who said. "Qua plus alta plus ete, French, you know. The more a man knows, the less he talks."
"But she has to use words for Meg and Calvin," Charles reminded Mrs. Who. "If you brought them along, they have a right to know what's going on."
Meg went up to Mrs. Witch. In the intensity of her question, she had forgotten all about the tesseract. "Is my father here?" Mrs. Witch shook her head.
"Not here, Meg. Let Mrs. Watson explain. She is young, and the language of words is easier for her than it is for Mrs. Who and me." "We stopped here," Mrs. Watson explained, "more or less to catch our breaths and to give you a chance to know what you're up against."
"But what about Father?" Meg asked. "Is he all right?"
"For the moment, love, yes. He's one of the reasons we're here. But, you see, he's only one."
"Well, where is he? Please take me to him."
"We can't, not yet," Charles said. "You have to be patient, Meg."
"But I'm not patient," Meg cried passionately. "I've never been patient." Mrs. Who's glasses shone at her gently. "If you want to help your father, then you must learn patience. Vitium pendre è vero, to stake one's life for the truth. That is what we must do."
"That is what your father is doing,"
Mrs. Watson nodded, her voice, like Mrs. Who's, very serious, very solemn. Then she smiled her radiant smile.
"Now, Why don't you three children wander around, and Charles can explain the things a little? You're perfectly safe on your own. That's why we stopped here to rest."
"But aren't you coming with us?" Meg asked fearfully. There was silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Witch raised her authoritative hand. "Show them," she said to Mrs. Watson, and at something in her voice Meg felt prickles of apprehension.
"Now?"
Mrs. Watson asked, her creaky voice rising to a squeak. Whatever it was Mrs. Witch wanted them to see, it was something that made Mrs. Watson uncomfortable too. "Now," Mrs. Witch said, "they may as well know."
Should I change?" Mrs. Watson asked.
"Better."
"I hope it won't upset the children too much," Mrs. Watson murmured as though to herself.
"Well, should I change too?" Mrs. Who asked.
"Oh, but I've had fun in these clothes. But I'll have to admit Mrs. Watson is the best at it. Das Werk lobet den Meister, German. The work proves the craftsman. Shall I transform too?"
Mrs. Witch shook her head.
"Not yet. Not here. You may wait." "Now, don't be frightened, loves," Mrs. Watson said.
Her plump little body began to shimmer, to quiver, to shift. The wild colors of her clothes became muted, whitened. The pudding-bag shape stretched and lengthened, merged, and suddenly before the children was a creature more beautiful than any Meg had even imagined, and the beauty lay in far more than the outward description. Outwardly, Mrs. Watson was surely no longer a Mrs. Watson. She was a marble white body with powerful flanks, something like a horse, but at the same time completely unlike a horse, for from the magnificently modeled back sprang a nobly formed torso, arms, and a head resembling a man's, but a man with a perfection of dignity and virtue, an exultation of joy such as Meg had never before seen. No, she thought, it's not like a Greek centaur, not in the least. From the shoulders, slowly, a pair of wings unfolded, wings made of rainbows, of light upon water, of poetry. Calvin fell to his knees. "No," Mrs. Watson said, though her voice was not Mrs. Watson's voice. "Not to me, Calvin. Never to me. Stand up."
"Carry them," Mrs. Witch commanded.